This is our second lecture for Bio 181. We're going to be talking about small molecules now. If you've previously had a chemistry class, this is probably going to be just review for you. You may want to just read the book instead. It's up to you. We're going to be talking first about what exactly atoms are, and then we're going to build our way up to things called molecules, which are a bit more complex. So starting out with atoms, if we look at any kind of element on the planet, let's take aluminum for example, and we took a chunk of aluminum and we started to take that cube and divide that cube up into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. Eventually at some point we would divide it into such a tiny piece that it would no longer hold the qualities that we associate with aluminum. The smallest item that still holds all the qualities we associate with aluminum, the temperature at which it melts and when does it turn to solid and how does it behave when it interacts with other metals, for example, that smallest unit is called an atom. Okay, so an atom is the smallest unit of matter that still retains all of the properties that we associate with that particular matter. You can have atoms of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, aluminum, chromium, copper, iodine, helium, hydrogen, you name it. Okay, but an atom is the smallest unit that still retains all the properties of that particular element. And if we look at the structure of an atom, and let's take the simplest atom out there, which is an atom of hydrogen. An atom always has at its center something we call a nucleus, and then surrounding that nucleus are particles that orbit in constant, very rapid movement around that nucleus, and those are called electrons. Now, a nucleus of an atom can be made up of just one proton in the case of hydrogen, and a proton is a small subparticle that has a positive charge to it. Or if we get to anything more complex than hydrogen, the nucleus actually contains more than just protons. It also contains another type of subatomic particle called a neutron. And as the name implies, a neutron is neutral. It has no charge to it. So if we look at carbon over here, in carbon we have protons and neutrons both present inside of that nucleus here. Now, surrounding the nucleus, again, as I said, and orbiting at an incredibly rapid pace are these things called electrons. And electrons have a negative charge to them. And the number of electrons orbiting around the nucleus will be exactly equal to the number of protons or positively charged subatomic particles that are found within the nucleus. So they balance each other out. The number of neutrons can vary because, of course, depending on the element, you have more or less neutrons, but because they have no charge to them, they don't affect the number of protons, they don't affect the number of electrons. Let me back up here one second before I go into this next slide. You should, if you're not already familiar with it, make sure you're familiar with some of the common abbreviations we use for different kinds of atoms we see commonly in molecules we're going to be studying in the class. Hydrogen, capital H, carbon, capital C, nitrogen, capital N, oxygen, capital O, chlorine, capital C, small l, a few others, sodium, capital N, small a. There's some others like calcium, which is capital C, small a. What else do we use with some regularity? Potassium, which is just a capital K. Copper, sometimes you'll see that, capital C, small u. So anyway, if you are not familiar with the abbreviations that chemists use to refer to some of these atoms, please be sure to brush up on that so that you're not lost when we start talking about more complex chemistry in a little bit. Now, if I have two or more atoms sharing electrons with one another, two or more atoms sharing electrons, then I have what's called a molecule. Okay? And a molecule means I've got two or more atoms of the same element. So if I were to join these two atoms of hydrogen together, I now have a molecule of hydrogen. Now, if I join, let's say, an atom of hydrogen with an atom of chlorine, then I have a molecule again, but it's a special kind of molecule called a compound. And the reason we call it a compound is because it contains two or more different elements within the molecule. And now these molecules that share electrons with each other can share electrons in a number of different ways. And anytime I have some sort of an interaction with electrons between two different atoms or more atoms, that's called a bond. And there are different kinds of bonds, covalent and ionic. Let's start with covalent bonds. In covalent bonds, there is some sort of sharing of electrons. Sometimes that sharing is nice and equal, like you see between these two hydrogen ions, and the electrons, which are represented by these little dots in the picture here, are found more or less equidistant or in the middle between the nuclei, or the two nucleus, of these two hydrogen atoms. Sometimes covalent bonds are not equally shared, and I'll talk about that in a second. You'll see that the electrons are physically located closer to one of the atoms and farther away from the other atom. Another type of bond is something called an ionic bond. And in an ionic bond, the sharing is very unequal. In fact, it's so unequal that what happens is one of the two atoms involved in the ionic bond actually gives up one or more of its electrons completely to one or more other atoms, and the other atom actually accepts that electron. So I'll give you an example. If we look at table salts, sodium chloride, capital N, small a, capital C, small l, sodium chloride or table salt is a compound. Okay, it's a compound because it's two or more atoms of different things bound together in a molecule. And if I take sodium chloride and I dissolve it in a solute such as water, what we see is that the sodium atom right here actually lets one of its electrons go. This electron in this sodium atom actually moves over to the chloride, okay, and it's taken up by that chlorine. And in the process of doing that, of course, the sodium has lost one of its negative charges, so it gains a positive charge, because remember, now it still has positively charged protons in its nucleus, and it has one more proton now than it does electrons because it's lost an electron, so it gains a positive charge. Meanwhile, the chloride ion has accepted that electron, so now it has an overall negative charge because it has fewer protons in its nucleus than it does electrons surrounding it. Anytime an atom gains or loses an electron, it becomes what we call an ion. In nutrition, we sometimes call ions electrolytes, by the way, if you're interested. The ion that becomes positively charged, for example, the sodium in this case, we call a cation to indicate it's positively charged. The ion that gains the electrons, such as the chloride ion down here, we call an anion. So next up, we're going to talk about different kinds of covalent bonds. Ionic bonds, remember, are when electrons are freely given up or donated to another atom. Covalent bonds, we have sharing of the electrons between two atoms, and that sharing can be nice and equal, or it can be very unequal. If the sharing of the electrons between two atoms, let's say these two atoms of hydrogen right here, if the sharing of the electrons is equal, in other words, the distance at which the electrons are located between the two atoms is exactly equal or right in the middle it's equidistant between the two atoms, then that is what we call a non-polar covalent bond. Polar means relating to having some sort of a charge attached to it. And because the electrons are exactly halfway in between these two atoms, then they are equally balancing out the positive charges of the nuclei, okay, with the protons. On the other hand, let's take a look at a water molecule like this one down here. In a water molecule, I have an atom of oxygen that is covalently bonded to two atoms of hydrogen. And what's interesting about this is if you look at this oxygen molecule, it turns out oxygen compared to hydrogen tends to be what we call electron greedy. It tends to want to hold onto electrons with greater strength than does the hydrogen atom. So the oxygen will tend to, almost like a magnet in a way, it will tend to pull the electrons from the hydrogen ion down here closer to it. Okay, so here is my hydrogen electron, and notice how this hydrogen's electron is much more closely aligned. It's closer to the oxygen atom than it is to the hydrogen atom. Same thing with this hydrogen's electron over here. The hydrogen's electron has been sucked up really close to the oxygen atom and pulled really far away from the hydrogen atom. And what that does then is, in essence, it makes it almost like this oxygen has taken on these electrons. And so we say it gains a partial negative charge. And if you look here, this little Greek symbol delta with the negative sign next to it, we use the Greek symbol delta to represent partial. And the negative indicates that it's a negative charge. So this is a partial negative charge. It's not a true negative charge because I didn't actually completely give away or donate my electron to oxygen. It's just that the hydrogen's electron is physically located closer to the oxygen atom and farther away from the hydrogen atom. And so the oxygen takes on some characteristics of behaving almost like it's negatively charged. Meantime, because this hydrogen down here has more or less kind of lost of its electron is so far away from its nucleus, the nucleus behaves as though it has a partial positive charge. And you can see that represented by this Greek symbol delta with a positive sign next to it. When I have a covalent bond like this with unequal sharing, where one atom tends to be greedy and hold the electrons closer to it and farther away from the other atom, that's called a polar covalent bond. Polar meaning having some sort of a charge to it. Okay, so covalent bonding is all about sharing electrons. We can share them very equally, in which case we have a nonpolar bond with no partial charges involved. Or we can have covalent bonding in which the sharing of electrons is pretty unequal. And in that case, we get these regions of partial positive and partial negative charges, and that leads to a polar covalent bond. All right, let's talk for just a second about how the original atoms that we had on planet Earth way back about 4.8 billion years ago when the Earth was first formed, how did those different kinds of atoms start getting together to make molecules and compounds that eventually gave rise to the first single-celled organism? Well, that's a pretty darn complex process. But we had 1 billion years to do it, okay, from about 4.8 billion years old, which is what we think the Earth was when it was formed, was about 4.8 billion years ago, until 3.8 billion years ago when we had what we considered to be the first life form appear on the planet. When we started out and looked at the initial atmosphere and the different kinds of atoms present in primordial Earth, or the first Earth, we had lots of carbon, we had hydrogen atoms, we had nitrogen atoms, we had oxygen atoms, we had lots of others too, but those are the big important ones. And they were floating around in the atmosphere, and all atoms constantly are moving about. They have a kinetic energy to them. They're always vibrating, and they're bumping into each other and crashing into each other. And in the presence of photons, which are little energy packets that come from the sun, these photons will induce, or did induce, these different individual atoms like carbon and hydrogen atoms and nitrogen and oxygen atoms to form covalent bonds with one another, which is what you see here. Nitrogen to nitrogen bonds, here's a water molecule, here's a carbon bonded to oxygen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we had all of these different simple compounds forming up in the atmosphere thanks to the input of energy in the form of photons of light from the sun. And these then, some of them got taken down into the ocean, and we started forming even more complex molecules, things like, and this was a key one, formaldehyde, which is carbon with some oxygen and hydrogens attached to it. And in the presence of heat, for example, from volcanic eruptions underneath the ocean that heated up the water to a very, very high temperature, we induced the formation of even more complex molecules that we call organic molecules. Organic molecules are molecules that have at least one carbon in them. And it's from these organic molecules that we begin to get the kinds of interactions that eventually led to the formation of first life. Now, there were a couple of researchers by the name of Urey and Miller, and they did their research, by the way, at University of Montana, where I got my undergraduate degree and one of my master's degrees, and they did a very interesting experiment. They took a flask and filled it full of all the types of atoms they knew were present on planet Earth when it was first formed 4.8 billion years ago. And then they passed electricity through that flask to represent things like lightning, and they passed photons of light from sunlight into that flask. And they looked to see, after they ran that experiment for a while, they heated it up as well. By the way, they got heat going here. And they looked to see what kind of molecules would form spontaneously if they had these atoms present, these photons of light, electricity and heat. And what they found, by golly, was that they did get precursor and simple organic molecules spontaneously forming in this flask. This is called the Urey-Miller experiment. And it was the first one to really suggest that, hey, it is absolutely possible that organic molecules could have formed spontaneously in primordial Earth, and that these eventually led to the rise of the first living organism. So what are all these different molecules of life that were formed? Well, we can broadly define them into two categories. There are those called organic molecules, and these are all of the molecules that have at least one carbon atom present somewhere in the molecule. And we're going to learn shortly in the coming weeks that there are 4 different classifications or groups of organic molecules. Carbohydrates, which are all the things like sugar, starch, cellulose, etc. Nucleic acids, things like DNA and RNA. Lipids, or a fancy word for fats, like trans fatty acids, partially hydrogenated fats, monosaturated fats, etc. And then proteins, the stuff you find in meat, different kinds of amino acids. Those are the 4 groups of organic molecules. All molecules on the planet that contain carbon, nearly all of them fit into one of these categories. One exception is carbon dioxide, which does contain a carbon, so it's technically an organic molecule, but this is a gas that we produce as part of our respiration process. We'll learn about that later. The other major classification of molecules is inorganic molecules, and as you imagine, inorganic molecules are just molecules that do not have a carbon present in their makeup. They don't have a carbon atom in them, but they're still incredibly important. Water, for example, is an inorganic molecule, and yet water is absolutely critical to life on Earth. Males have about 60% water in their bodies. Females have about 52% water, so it makes up a huge component of us as living organisms. And we're going to learn later on in this class that water is necessary for almost every single process that goes on in our bodies. There are lots of different gases that are inorganic. Nitrogen gas, which makes up about 70% of the air that we breathe in and out, is not an organic molecule, but it nonetheless is quite prevalent and quite important. Oxygen gas, which is absolutely essential for us to live, is not an organic molecule, and yet it's quite important. And then there's lots of different minerals, things like copper and sodium, potassium, chlorine, magnesium, manganese, fluorine. All kinds of different minerals out there are critical to us living, and yet they are not organic molecules. Now, if we look at the composition of living things, and let's take us for example, we know that 96% of all of the atoms in our body are either oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, or nitrogen. And the 4% that remains are things like calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and other trace elements. But the key component of our body, as I said before, is water. Okay, if you're male, about 60% of your body weight is water. If you're female, it's slightly less. We compare that to planet Earth, 75% of the Earth is covered with water. So water is a really critical component of living organisms. Since water is such a critical substance for life on planet Earth, I want to spend some time and talk about its unique properties. And I think we're going to stop this right now, and I'll pick up the properties and qualities of water in part 2 of this lecture. So I'll see you there.